All right. Okay. Hey, everyone. My name is Greg Kunkel. I'm a co-founder here at NextJump. And Laura and I are going to be tag teaming today to give an intro over what we call resiliency training, a program that we have here at NextJump. And I think for all of us right now going through COVID, what we're all being challenged with organizationally for families, I think resiliency is needed and improved resiliency needed for all of us. And when I think about resiliency and I kind of refer to the term, I'm really talking about emotional resiliency and taking a step back. I think for us in terms of as individuals and as leaders, decision-making is at the core of kind of our responsibility and what we do. And I think, good decision-making is very much related to, very good self-awareness. And I think all of us have blind spots of which we think about in many ways awareness as a team sport, not an individual sport. And we need the help of others to give us feedback, give us truth around the reality of our decisions, our behaviors at times. And oftentimes I think about when us as individuals, we don't get that feedback. We're in a cocoon of it. Oftentimes accidents can happen. Sometimes within organizations, we only may get feedback primarily from our boss. Some of the truth that may come once or twice a year. How can we in our own locus of controls make it easier for others to tell us the truth? And we use this term here called our red arrow behaviors, I'll explain in a second, that prevent others from telling us the truth. And this resiliency training program is really designed to increase the awareness and then practice dialing down our red arrow behaviors that prevent others from giving us the truth. So a little bit about what we're gonna, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm gonna spend a few more minutes on the context around resiliency training. And then Laura, who's halfway through, kind of within her group, her own resiliency training is gonna give her kind of case study, her real example of what she's going through now. And then we'll have 10 or so minutes for Q&A. It can be directed to Laura. I'm happy to take some as well. And then we'll touch on some next steps. So I'm gonna start with about a minute and 50-second video of what resiliency training is not. And for some of you may be familiar with Larry David as I shift over to kind of play this video. Larry David was a writer for Seinfeld. He has a show called Curb Your Enthusiasm and is known in many ways for being a quote unquote truth teller. So let me play the clip and then.
Now, Larry, you would admit that you have a way of cutting through all the BS in everyday life that most people cannot.
I suppose you could say that.
Like, for example, I saw you backstage before the show. I said, I'm really excited that you're back. And you said excited. Excited seems like a strong word.
Yeah, I mean, you do this every day. This is what excites you?
Yeah. And I guess I'm jealous of your ability to be honest. So I got to thinking, wouldn't it be nice if everyone had their own Larry David to say what they're really thinking at any given moment? And you were kind enough to grant me and members of our staff that wish. Let's take a look.
Okay, so the idea would be, what's Melania thinking? And we would take like photos of Melania and we put a thought balloon over her head, and the joke would be what she's thinking, like, get me the hell out of this marriage, or even my hands are bigger than this guy's hands, stuff like that.
Yeah, interesting.
And it would be repeatable because there's so many photos and clips of Melania out there.
Uh-huh.
So do you want to try it for rehearsal, or?
Let me think about it.
All right, come on. I can't listen to this. Let me think about it. Are you serious? He's not going to think. He doesn't want to think about it.
Really? Because he said it was interesting.
Interesting? That was a fake interesting.
It's a fake interesting.
Fake interesting is this. Here's a fake interesting. Interesting. Here's a real interesting. Interesting.
Well, I do have other ideas that I could pitch.
I'll bet. That was your first idea. I'm sure it was your best, right? Please, you're insulting us here.
It was my best idea.
Yeah.
You're right, and
Yeah.
I do apologize.
Okay, apology accepted.
It comes so easy to you.
There's nothing to it.
It's not hard at all?
No.
You don't worry about his feelings?
Because I understand, honey.
So as I bring back up the kind of slides here, I think this goes on. If you're interested, you can Google it. It's a longer clip and it's funny, but I think, it kind of gets to this point of One approach could be, training kind of truth tellers within organizations to give more candid feedback. Oftentimes, for those of you who have led teams, you're probably familiar sometimes the pressure of peers don't want to give feedback to each other. They bubble up kind of problems, and you as a boss have to go and now be your version of Larry David to others. And that's very difficult. So this is what it's not. It's not training people on how to give better feedback, be more candid, be truth. There is an element of training for that. But we took a look of what's a different approach. And we use on the left here, I'll explain this side of kind of resiliency training. This is, apologize for non-kind of football fans, but Nick Saban is one of the most successful college football coaches. He coaches Alabama. And he has this kind of ethos where he talks about the difference between average players to good players and great players. And he says average players want to be left alone. Good players want to be coached. Great players want to be told the truth. Now, one element that we have a feedback-oriented culture, and they're just getting a lot of feedback doesn't necessarily mean and equate that you're going to be a successful, in your work, in your et cetera. But one of the things we've seen very clearly in the data that matches up with this is that those individuals that are not getting feedback are very correlated to poor performance, typically poor decision-making. And I think this gets at it. So as an organizational approach, there's one part, you can train more Larry Davids. We've taken it of put the locus of control back on individuals. For each of us, we all have what we call our red arrow behaviors of the closest people around us. It could be for me to my wife, could be to my kids, it could be to my boss, it could be to my closest peers. What are my red arrow behaviors that prevent others from telling me the truth, creating what we call this echo chamber of silence? And as you're able to identify those, and some of those red arrow behaviors are kind of counterintuitive. So I'll give you a for instance, and Laura will. Things like, I use this all the time. I'll say, I got it. Someone will explain something to me and I got it. And sometimes my behaviors may end up showing that I actually don't know it. I may not fully get it. But now it requires in many ways somebody else to kind of say like, well, he said I've got it, but I can see he doesn't. Am I now going to tell him, no, you didn't, even though you said it? That's an example of just a very simple, kind of innocuous red arrow behavior. Others that I've said as well is, I'm trying my best. So even though I'm trying my best, that's in some ways a distancing part of now who's going to give me feedback saying, all right, I know you said that you're trying your best, but let me tell you all the ways that you could do a lot better with this or things that you could dial down. That's really difficult. So, and I'm not even subconsciously trying to be like, I don't want your feedback. And I am probably trying my best. And so there are ways within groups to be able to identify it. So having said that, and Laura will go into more detail specifically for her and her experience. It's a 13-week program of which we have kind of curriculum and everything. We kind of keep this curriculum. It's on Perks of Work. Everyone can take advantage of it. And let me just explain how the 13-week program is broken up. There are in essence 3 phases of it, broken out 4 weeks, 4 weeks, and then the last phase is 5 weeks. So total it's 13 weeks. So Laura, as she explains it, is in the middle of phase 2. The first phase is a set of kind of worksheets you come prepared. It's a group of about 8 to 12 peers. So it tends to be kind of your peers that you work with, sometimes closest, others that may be across kind of organization. And the first phase is what we call the investment phase. And the group and individuals identify their clear bad of going towards an outcome of things that you're responsible for. If it gets worse, what might that look like? So I might run a part of the business, I run my part of a team, I might, family, et cetera. What do I really not want to happen 3 to 6 months from now? Then you start to identify my own red arrow behaviors, and you get feedback on that from the group, and people share that within the group. As you move to phase 2, you're now putting some of those red arrow behaviors into practice in your day job, within your life, and you come back and individuals will then present how they prioritize. What's the top red arrow behavior? What's not the top red arrow behavior? What's the least? And they talk about how they practice and get feedback to it. That ROI period, that phase 3, is when people are really starting to see this show up within within the results, within their work and within their life. So with that, Laura, I'm going to turn over to you, and she'll walk you through kind of her own kind of learnings and reflections. And again, she's halfway through her course.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. And hi, everybody. Nice to be with you today. So my name is Laura, and I'm based in New York, and I've been at Next Jump, or a Next Jumper, as we like to call it, for over 10 years. I want to take you through some of my own experience being a participant in resiliency training. Our group has 12 people in it. So we've been meeting since some point in February, and as Greg mentioned, are in phase 2. I think we've got one more session in phase 2, so a little bit more than halfway through. This is a picture here of the New York office. We're talking about peer feedback today, so I felt it was appropriate before jumping into the specifics to have a nice visual there. So I'm going to share my actual behaviors worksheet with you all and walk through my journey so far. But before that, I wanted to share the biggest lessons this experience has given me thus far. So the first one is how much that really other people really pick up on. So these behaviors are signals that you're sending out to others. To you, they seem really small or like they wouldn't matter, but your perception of things is different than the receiver, and that matters. And so that has been kind of like my number one learning so far. And the second one then is the unintentional second or third order consequences that these behaviors cause. For me, it's been a real eye opener to see the unintended ripple effect of some of my signals. So if you go on to the next slide, this is a snapshot of my experience through resiliency training so far. I've had my ups and my downs. Starting for the first session, it was a low point. As Greg mentioned, it's when you're coming to terms with the fact that you've actually been stuck or hiding. There were members of our group that had not received any feedback. We have a feedback app that you're all using this through the Academy for over 6 months. And getting called out on that is not an amazing feeling. If you click next, Greg, I grabbed a note here from our facilitator from the first session that we had. 50% of the group, it was easier to accept, and 50% of the group did have some resistance and fight around this and struggled with any stigma of being attached, to this process. We start each session with what's on your mind. So we had a lot of people feeling like, why am I here? Am I really stuck? It's also hard to be open right off the bat as the group doesn't really have established trust. You know these people, these are your peers. It's not like you're coming in cold, but you're still trying to figure out the dynamics. So it was a rough session. The main content is that you actually spend time putting pen to paper around some fears. What would actually happen to you and those around you if you got worse at your core role, and sharing that. For me, I'm in charge of our New York flagship project, which is building out our future office space. So my errors and poor judgment calls could cost the company millions of dollars. And I'm also accountable to the whole office of like 60 or plus people, where in normal circumstances, you would come in every day, and there's just so much more riding on that project. So I would have a lot of shame if I let my colleagues down in that area. Going to the second session, this is started when you get into the specifics of these red arrow behaviors. And I felt a little bit better coming out of that session. You realize that everyone has things that they need to work on. And there are a decent amount of commonalities, people struggling with the same things that you are. So I felt less alone. As things progressed, the first time I presented, I did get some hard to hear feedback, not only in person, but also, via the app. I'll spotlight this a little bit later, but my peers brought up that my outward expression of emotion prevented them from really being able to give me full, unfiltered feedback. And I was actually angry reading some of the feedback that I got initially, very defensive, essentially kind of like WTF, these people don't really get me. But as I went through the presentations, I was able to have a more productive feedback discussion with my group. And we uncovered some things that I really do need to work on. And I had an aha moment, if you will. Close to that, I also had the opportunity to give an update in our staff meeting on this training, since a lot of our company is going through the same training right now. And I took it as an opportunity not to play it safe. And I shared my red arrow list with the entire company. So exactly what I'm going to show you in a couple minutes as a deliberate, intense practice ground to help me get more comfortable with being vulnerable, which is something that I need to work on. And I wasn't sure what was going to come out of it. I was super nervous. It's very personal, as you'll see, but I got a cool response. I pulled up a piece of feedback that I received here. It was a valuable lesson to me that even exposing my bad I can actually help people. So that was a big learning for me. But taking a step back, I want to focus on that initial aha moment. So if you could go to the next slide. I won't go through everything. This is a lot, but this is my actual worksheet. You don't need to read it all. I'll just highlight a couple things. But I thought it would be helpful to expose how my list has evolved between sessions, some of the nuances and edits that the group helped me make from time to time. For me, I tend not to vent or expose my own issues openly. And this has created an unintentional barrier for others to bring up problems to me, theirs or my own. And because the appearance that I give off is that I have everything together, even though I don't. So as a result, people don't want to expose their messiness to me. I color-coded the insights from the different sessions, found that there were a lot of connected or complementary behaviors seen here with the arrows, like the trend of keeping things surface level. I think kind of through this experience, because some of this stuff is so close to me, I don't really understand the way it's coming off to other people. I thought I did, but I was actually surprised how differently the group felt. So if you go to the next slide, diving a level deeper here, I actually wanted to share how I went about creating that list that I just showed you, that red arrow behavior list. I ended up following a framework we use at NextJump for digesting feedback called LBR, which stands for Light, Break, and Revisit. When you read feedback for the first time, it can be intense. Personally, I always tend to read in things in like the worst way possible initially. This last time I presented from home, so I vented with my husband, but I came back days later and I printed out all my feedback from the entire process so far, and I looked for patterns. I tried to challenge my assumptions and the reasons in my head and prioritize how others were feeling above myself through this exercise. And a big piece turned out to be this emotional piece that I brought up. I was really having a hard time understanding how important this really was. I talked about my initial reaction and was like, geez, it's not like I'm walking around crying all the time, and I dismissed it. And in fact, most of the in-person feedback in the sessions I was getting was around being buttoned up in this air of I got it, not being very vulnerable. But in the app, something else showed up as well, which was that emotional piece. So a couple of the actual pieces of feedback I received here, I viewed the feedback app as a source of quantitative data. Of all the feedback, I think there were 36 pieces of feedback that I got. Emotions in some capacity were mentioned in about, I think, 20% of them. So to me, that was an indicator that it's not really something I can brush off. So although people were giving me some candid feedback in the sessions, the app still preserved an outlet, where people were still calling out that emotion piece, which they felt like they couldn't talk to me about in person. So between the in-person, conversations through the resiliency training and the app, I was able to get a more full picture of my signals from my peers. So if you go to the next slide, coming out of this, when you now prioritize your list, so this is my latest prioritized list. We do a CAB approach. So the C's being the behaviors that are the least important, A's being the most important to work to like dial down or reduce. For me, I had one visceral A, which was to dial down the air being buttoned up. I found that I was doing this not only in person, but actually in email, which was a big insight for me, using a lot of crutch phrases. Like when people asked me how things were, they would be like, oh, I'd be like, good, great, oh, fine. I also did a little bit of the got it that Greg mentioned when something was going. And essentially that kind of acts as like a blocker to send the message of, like, leave me alone. It just shuts down the conversation. I'm not going to have a real conversation with you. And then what started as my C, being emotional and oftentimes, crying during difficult conversations, moved up to an A per the feedback that I got in the app. And then, as we discussed it kind of grew to include my facial expressions, as I tend to wear my heart on my sleeve. So it's not as black and white as I initially interpreted it, but what I think is cool is that after I brought this up myself to the group in person, we were able to have a productive conversation about it. So if you go to the next slide, it hasn't been an easy or flattering conversation. Talking about this stuff now, having gone a few times within my group, has been getting easier, and there's less stigma to talking about it since we all have something that we need to work on. I feel my group hasn't been holding back, but I think what's important is I do feel a lot of care, which makes it so much easier to open, reflect, and accept what people are saying. It's actually been a cool dynamic. We've had almost heated debates over signals for people, but it's all coming from that place of care. It's actually a very unique setting. I pulled a couple examples here of reflections of on my minds from other members of my group that gave me permission to share with you all today. Things like I'm less scared now. It's been an eye-opener, people trying to help. No one has ever invested in better me that much. That's kind of a saying that we have at Next Jump, where it means investing in yourself. Really echoed my experience as well. And so although we're like, just coming out of halfway through, now we can kind of get after actually practicing dialing down these behaviors and check in, where we're at. So it's a work in progress. But for me, it's helped me be more aware of how I'm coming off to others. And, especially when I don't have it together, and speak up in more situations. And even though that might not be pretty, there's still value there versus hiding it. So that's kind of what I've learned here. So I'll hand it to Corey.
So why don't we open up for some questions now from anyone in the group, either to Laura or myself.
You guys can just go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand in the chat.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, is the app a requirement? Did you get that?
Laura, if you want to start, Laura, to
Sure.
take the first one, I can always fill in, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an absolute requirement. I think it's additive to the experience. I think you can be still having these conversations in person. But, through my experience, the app did actually preserve an outlet for folks to actually say some things that, they had trouble saying to my face, essentially. So for context, this app is a way to give anonymous feedback in a setting. So I, didn't know necessarily who had said it, but it was something that was on their mind. And, it kind of gives that level of psychological safety for people to be more authentic. And although it was kind of hard to hear, I'm actually very grateful for it now, knowing that that's something that I don't want to go around my whole life and having people, think something about me or have like this be a blocker that's actually not intentional. So that was a really helpful piece for me. I don't know, maybe we would have gotten it there eventually if we didn't have the app, but I think it sped things up from my perspective.
Josh, if I could maybe weigh in a bit, I thought it was very interesting in digging into kind of what Laura went through. I'm not part of her training, but it was interesting when she presented or read her behaviors, she got a lot of comments on the put together, and that was some feedback from people they added on. They gave her specific nuances to it. Not one person in the group commented on when she gets overly emotional, it's hard to give her feedback. Not one. In the app, where it was kind of anonymous, people talked about that, almost 60% of the group did. And so I guess my point on this is it's that difficult in a social, to prevent, to put forth the social capital required for others to give the most difficult truth to each other. So I view in many ways kind of the feedback app it provides psychological safety to start those conversations and to add and make them richer. As the truth, and then Laura can speak to it more, but I've seen this consistently by the time you get to phase 2 and phase 3 of the group, there's so much more, the level of authenticity and the level of being able to tell the truth to each other in person is at a significantly higher level. But I would say that oftentimes as the group goes through that process, the feedback app can accelerate the most difficult parts of that conversation.
So maybe you can talk about, do we have access to the app?
Yeah, so we'll talk about it in next steps, but the short end is yes.
So I actually got a question in the chat, which was, how do you get everyone on board in this feedback system? So for our company at Next Jump, this is something that we've been using for years. So it's not necessarily in just the resiliency training setting. We use it for our weekly staff meetings or just our day-to-day. So it's something that's rolled out company-wide and everyone has access to. I mentioned that it's completely anonymous. So it is anonymous for everyone who posts, but transparent to the entire company what is being written. So anyone can kind of look up my feedback scores throughout the entire company and see that. So I think it's kind of it's helpful to know that, a lot of people are getting feedback. It's not just you. It's a good sign, but that's how we use it in our company. If there are other questions, you can just jump in and unmute.
Frank?
Yeah, thanks for hosting, and thank you, Laura, for sharing. Have you noticed, or actually I should start, a lot of what you put out seems to be with other people, how they receive your message and how they react to you. Have you kind of dug in a little bit deeper, or do you dig in deeper throughout the resiliency training to correlate anything, maybe with the On My Mind app, or maybe some triggers that come out and that people kind of receive from you?
So I think it's natural to do a lot of reflection, during this process. I think it's right now we're focusing more about what are the actual behaviors that we're doing and diagnosing it versus kind of like understanding the why behind it. But there's so much training behind that. I mean, when you join our company, everyone goes through a program called Personal Leadership Boot Camp. And what it is it's some time for you to actually identify, we all have strengths and weaknesses. So what are kind of your strengths and your weaknesses? We call that your backhand. So it's like a tennis analogy, everyone has your backhand. It's not usually as strong as your forehand. So what can you do to strengthen that and essentially become more balanced? An interesting piece for me is, the two things that I'm working on with the, dial down list is either being not vulnerable at all or actually being too vulnerable. Being overly emotional. So it's actually, we've seen that a lot in people that you actually can flip flop or, or switch on and off and kind of go to either extreme. So it's about training balance. We've talked a little bit about it. I mean, I think for me, I've been like an only child. So I've had to kind of just figure out stuff on my own in a lot of different situations. We moved around a lot when I was younger. So, making new friends all the time. I think you just kind of have you put like on a face sometimes, or you have like you don't really realize it, but I think it actually keeps you from, forming relationships. And that's, kind of what's been impacting me. So it's something that we do discuss kind of openly, but isn't as much structured within this training. But I mean, it's definitely spurred a lot of offline conversations between our group, which is actually kind of added to the supportive nature of it, where it's like, it's not just these formatted 1-hour sessions and it stops the conversation. I've had some really great conversations with my colleagues about some of this stuff as well.
And maybe, Frank, I'll just add a couple of thoughts on that on top of Laura. I think of, and part of what it is over 13 weeks is that combination of reflection plus feedback from others and not being alone, in the sense of, it's not like Laura's the only one kind of sharing. It's there, each person's kind of sharing their own, and people are expected. And again, these are peers. So this isn't a senior level, coming in and being kind of the expert on it. But that combination of each person is expected to contribute their own reflection, but then also expected to contribute to challenging and probing and helping the other person navigate some of that. And it's done over a period of time, so you have the ability to go and now practice in your life and your work. Laura didn't touch on it as much, and it'd be harder for her to say, but I think the part that's been very neat, she's at the end of this kind of phase 2, is, she reports directly to our co-CEOs, so Charlie and Megan, running an important project. And they've commented on, probably about 2 weeks ago at this point, the signals of how much she's sharing more in problems and challenges and kind of nuances and sharing some of the messiness. It's a hard project that they've just been, without any coaching from their side, they've commented of the change they've seen in Laura being able to be kind of more transparent in that part. They've seen the outcome of it, and it's a breath of fresh air in many ways in an area that has a lot of ramifications to the business.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Laura.
There are other questions? You can either put in chat or just raise hand, speak up.
Is the program free, or is that included with FIS? I am from FIS and I got a link from FIS.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll end with sharing kind of, we've had groups, we've run this training with many other different groups, and both the curriculum on how to set up a program, how to run it, along with the feedback app are all available at no cost. It looked like, I don't know if Nick left, but Nick, did you have a question? I see you raising your hand. Nick, I think your thing's still muted.
Okay, honestly, this is the first time I've actually used Zoom. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I'd like to express that you guys made a believer out of me, if it means anything. We move at the speed of trust, and when you can make your team feel like they're part of a family, where, you know, your mom or dad may scold you, or your coach may scold you, but that doesn't mean they're going to kick you off the team. Very difficult in the military to do, because it's the paradigm shift is so 180 out. But with all that I've seen downrange, you guys have used the SEALs as an example. That feeling of family, where you know that they really do care and that they're just trying to help you get better, it opens up so much, and you have that transparency is so powerful. It really is a game changer. So since I've been at the academy, I've been working to institutionalize that. I can't tell you how hard it's been, but we've made some real wins. And my biggest concern is, as a military member, we're all shifting in and out every couple of years. Creating a culture like that takes a lot of time. And then with all the movements, how do you ensure that that culture is enduring? Does that help? I hope that's relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick. It's a broader kind of question, so maybe I'll focus it more specifically as it relates to kind of this resiliency part, in the sense of, it is designed to be efficient from a leadership standpoint, and that it's peer driven. It doesn't require a lot of, coaching and other parts to it. And you touched on a topic which is really interesting of this, we call it connectedness, and where Josh Hurt, who's on this, and he's in the Air Force, and myself are going to give an overview at 3 o'clock of this kind of adaptive learning teams. And I'll touch on this a little bit more. But I do think this kind of notion of transparency, connectedness are crucial. And one of the things about the resiliency kind of training and program that has surprised us, I think, from a leadership standpoint, I think we designed it so that, oftentimes as leaders, you're getting a lot of noise, a lot of feedback, even more so than ever before. You get it from your team. There are different channels, Slack, emails. People are much more comfortable giving feedback today. So as leaders, you get it. So
you were breaking out. We couldn't hear the last part.
I was just saying that from a leadership standpoint, we often get a lot more feedback from others. There's a lot more transparency out there. And so we went into this saying that, for people on the team, if you could identify how to make it easier for others, this would be a win organizationally. The part we were surprised at is that, especially as like Laura's team and the other teams that have gone through this, by the time they get to phase 2, is the connectedness of the team really surprised us, the level of it. The trust that they've built and it makes sense in many ways, of being able to talk about common challenges, things that are difficult, to contribute to that and do it together, I would argue is a much more connecting mechanism than, in many ways, sometimes organizations go after it for fun stuff. So you do it your social hour at the end of the week. We have that as well. You're invited at 5 p.m. But we found that the connectedness around talking about difficult problems together and being, in many ways, open and vulnerable together, you can create a level of connectedness that is very strong within weeks.
I'll add on just quickly. Just as a testament to that, we had like a range of people, like some newer people who had only been there for, maybe like a year or so, plus people that, like me, who had been at the organization for like over 10 years. And I had people mention to me on the side, I feel like I got to know you in like the last, hour more than I've known you in the past 10 years. So I think, and that's kind of within an hour session. So that's just some of what we've had as a group. I got a question on the chat from Hannah. She asked if the training is online or live. I'm not sure if you meant the materials to train for the course or the actual courses themselves. So, you know, if we were non-COVID, we would be having these in a conference room in person together. Obviously, that's not possible right now. So we're doing them over the Zoom chat with the video. It's actually like pretty good. You can still see everyone's faces and it feels, you know, pretty interactive with a smaller session. And then if you meant like the training materials, they're all available online, and we are trying to have courses like this. Greg will mention, but we're also having a 3 p.m. session where you can actually observe one of these workshops this afternoon. So we're trying to do a little bit of both.
Maybe one more question, and then I'll summarize some next steps. And Frank, did you have another question or no?
Sorry, that was just a touch on my face.
No problem. No problem. Okay.
Hey, Greg, maybe you can talk about how did you judge peers? Because in the military we deal a lot with that, right? So how did you group people together?
Yep. And maybe that was a question that Laura had gotten to, that maybe the person was getting, is how do you choose people, especially if they might be skeptical, et cetera. So my recommendation would be is to, select as close as possible to a group of peers. And especially if you're looking to get some connectedness to it. I would advocate that you don't need the full buy-in up front. Our experience has been from everybody to be like, oh, I want to do this. I do think the context setting is really important. So, an example of what we just shared here is something that we would do with our own staff, so they understand the point of it, the intentions of it, and what we're trying to get at. And then when we pick a facilitator of that group, that we spend a little bit extra time in the beginning, kind of getting up to speed. So Josh, to your question, it's the closer you can get to a peer set that's around the level of experience, et cetera. Maybe it's a group within the office. Those are some techniques we've used kind of in our own judgment to kind of cluster people in ones that make sense. So some of it'll be based on situational, if you're a large team, a smaller team, et cetera. All right, let me reshare my screen real quick. So a few things for next steps. If you want, you can let us know if we had this after last week. If you want to sign your team up for resiliency training, let us know. I'm Greg at nextjump.com, so pretty easy to remember. Just send a note to us in the beginning of some of these. We're helping kind of organizations and kind of teams set that up. Combined with, there is a 13-week course curriculum along with all the worksheets. The worksheets are really in phase 1. They're 2 primary worksheets. And they're all available on Perks of Work. And also, if you can just go there directly and just start running it. But if you're interested and you let us know that you're setting one up, we'll get you on the right part. We're also considering running a facilitator workshop in future kind of online academies, depending on kind of interest. So the other part to this is when you sign your team up for resiliency training, you have access. There's a question around the feedback app. The feedback app that you're using now for the feedback among the classes, organizations can use it. You'll see your own organization's kind of a team within that. You can use that, as is. And then lastly, kind of an open invitation. Laura said, we have a 3 p.m. Next Jump session. We tried this for the first time last week, and it was, I think, really appreciated. So it's a little open kimono, so just keep that in mind. I think it's a Boston group today that's all remote, but they're you would be observing. So no kind of questions or other things. It's their actual. They're in the, I think, start of phase 2 of it within that group, but you can actually observe their resiliency training session today at 3.